Humans rewrite destiny, the fight against an empire of control. They said no signal ever pierced the Southern Alps, no drone ever survived the magnetic flares. And yet on the morning of August 3rd, 2603, at exactly 10:23 a.m., Earth time, a man touched something that should not have existed. A cold mountain wind sliced through the ridgeline, and with it the beginning of everything we thought we knew unraveled. Daxen Rowe didn't look like the kind of man who might change the trajectory of galactic history. Lean and tall, he blended with the pines and stone like he belonged to the terrain itself. A short crop of black hair clung damp to his forehead beneath a sun-bleached cap. His jacket, patched canvas, sun-worn, hung loose over thermoweave trekking pants, scuffed boots sinking lightly in the moss of the ridge. He moved like a ghost, as if the world below the last cities, the satellites, the wars no longer concerned him. For the last 5 years, the mountains above Lake Wakatipu, deep in New Zealand's South Island, had been his refuge. The Southern Alps rose like jagged teeth into cloud-mottled sky, veined with quartz and snow. Tourists stopped coming a decade ago after the solar fluctuations made navigation dangerous. The place had become invisible to satellites, unreadable by AI drones. To the world, it was dead, which made it perfect for someone who didn't want to be found. That day, he had taken a new path, and one he'd noticed weeks ago between two boulders the shape of vertebrae. The mist parted to reveal a low ridge creased by frost. His boot struck something hard beneath the moss. It rang. Not like stone, like tempered alloy. Curious, he dropped to a knee and brushed the moss away with bare fingers. Dirt flaked. The object shimmered like wet obsidian embedded just below the surface, smooth with delicate engravings running along its curved edge. Not language. Not any language he knew. They were glyphs, perhaps, but they shifted when he tilted his head as if reacting to his thoughts. "That's not metal," he murmured. It pulsed once dim blue like something breathing. Instinctively, he pulled back. Nothing happened. Then, against every survival instinct honed by solitude and bitter winter, he pressed his hand flat against it. The pulse turned white. A low hum began to rise, not mechanical, but subsonic like the purr of tectonic plates. He gasped. His vision tilted. The mountain vanished. No transition, no warning. Suddenly, he was in the middle of a corridor lit by violet light. The walls curved in a way Euclidean geometry refused. Shadowed forms passed without looking at him, humanoid, but tall, armored in plated glass, speaking in tones like ringing crystal. He turned to follow, but then the scene fractured. A field, smoke and dust. Bodies strewn across cracked black soil. Moons overhead, not Earth's. 3, maybe 4, then another flash. A woman, her face rimmed in light eyes glowing silver, reached for him. No, someone else. She whispered his name. Not Daxen. Echo. He staggered back, eyes wide, hand clutching the air, as the vision shattered and the world of moss and cold returned. He collapsed on the ridge chest, heaving, heartbeat erratic. The object lay quiet once more. It hadn't just shown him something. It had pulled something from him, something that wasn't his. He blinked at the sky. Thin clouds passed. Somewhere a hawk cried. The silence felt too still. Later in his shelter, a converted geothermal station tucked into a cave face. Daxen stared at the artifact now resting on a metal plate. He hadn't thrown it away. He hadn't buried it back. And that unsettled him more than the hallucinations. "I should be terrified," he muttered aloud, sipping rain-filtered tea. "I should run. But I've seen that place before." He didn't mean in a dream. He meant it like a memory. The device, whatever it was, had activated when he touched it. No external power source. No circuitry. But he recalled the way it had pulsed just for him, as if it knew he was there, as if it had waited. He spent the night examining it under his microtorch. The outer casing was impossibly smooth, like obsidian sculpted without tools. Heat didn't register on his thermal lens. When he tapped it, the interior rang not with metal, but with the dull echo of something denser. Inside, he could feel the hum, low, rhythmic, matching his own heartbeat at times. It wasn't built on Earth. That much he knew. By morning, he'd stopped asking what it was. He had begun asking why him. The Aogiak hadn't stopped. Not in sleep, not even while awake. When he blinked, he saw brief flashes, hands in armor symbols etched on starship walls, a red moon rising over metal ruins. And worst of all, the woman. She always said his name like she expected him to answer for sins he couldn't remember. He wanted to believe it was all a stress hallucination. Isolation does strange things to the mind, but that didn't explain the glyphs adjusting to his fingerprints, or the moment he whispered the name Echo aloud and the device purred in response. What frightened him more than anything, though, was his own calm. He should have panicked, screamed, fled. Instead, Daxen made a list. He cataloged what he saw, recorded descriptions of the armor, the glyphs, even the patterns of light. He cross-referenced his old astrophysics database for matching star systems. None of it matched Earth, but it fit him. He caught his reflection in the geothermal station's cracked mirror that evening. Something in his face looked different. Not older, not younger, just more precise, sharpened. "This isn't mine," he whispered, touching his temple. Yet it felt like it was, like waking up and realizing the dream had been your real life all along. That was the moment he knew. He wasn't entirely human, or if he was, not anymore. The first dream did not arrive softly. It came like a war cry muffled by static. Daxen stood nor ran through corridors of a ship that groaned with distant cannon fire. Sirens blared in alien tones. Lights flickered red and violet. Around him the walls curved unnaturally smooth and metallic, like they were grown rather than forged. Soldiers sprinted past, none looked like him. Some were hairless, others glowed faintly under the skin. But all saluted when they saw him. They called him Echo, and then as the dream seemed to collapse into clarity, he stood before a cracked viewport. Through it, a planet below burning with plasma trails, its upper atmosphere torn open. He felt nothing. Then he awoke, heart pounding, the taste of ozone still in his mouth. Each night brought another fragment. A command table lit by holographic threads of military logistics. A city floating between gravity wells, its towers bent like reeds in orbital storms. A red-cloaked woman staring down an entire council, her voice soft, but absolute control is the only piece. What disturbed him most was the ease with which his mind accepted these places. He didn't marvel, he recognized, as if he were returning, not dreaming. And they weren't peaceful dreams. They were built of tension-duty violence, machines in prayer, codes in blood, his hands firing weapons that had never existed on Earth. Each detail was crisp, undeniable. He knew how to disassemble a serolithic pulse rifle. He knew how to pilot a cruciform skimmer between asteroid flares. But Daxen had never left Earth. In waking hours, he would sometimes pause, mid-sentence, mid-thought, gripped by a whisper of memory, someone yelling orders in a language he never learned, but somehow understood. "I'm not just dreaming," he said to himself one morning after waking from a scene where he barked orders at beings with silicon eyes. "I'm remembering." But how could his subconscious have fabricated such complex data from nothing? Neural echo, perhaps, some buried trauma mutated into symbolic memory, or was something external injecting the images? He stared at the black artifact still inert on the shelf. Something inside him whispered the answer, but he wasn't ready to say it aloud. The second night after the first dream, he stopped sleeping entirely. He crafted stem tea from local bark, ran up ridge lines until his muscles tore, did push-ups in the snow until dawn cracked. Anything to stay conscious. But exhaustion always wins. And the moment his eyes fluttered shut, she was there. The woman, made of shimmer and silence. She stood tall in a room made of pure light skin, slightly translucent hair, a braid of moving data streams. Her armor didn't gleam, it glowed refracted like living glass. Her eyes silver pools without iris or pupil. She looked at him with something between grief and awe. "You're late," she said. He awoke with a scream so loud it triggered the geothermal station's seismic warning. When it faded, she was still there. Not in the dream, in his room, or rather projected. The artifact hovered half an inch off the steel plate. Around it spiraled glyphs of soft white light, forming a lattice of logic that reached the ceiling. At the center, the woman suspended like a flame in midair. A hologram, but not like anything from Terran tech. No flicker, no pixel grid. She was perfect, mapped in full dimension, her breath visible, her voice layered with harmonics. "I apologize for the delay," she said calmly. System recovery was slower than expected. Daxen reached instinctively for his walking staff. "I wouldn't," she said. You might break your own ribs. He paused. Not because of her threat, but because he believed her. Who are you? I am Malus, she replied. Tactical Substrate AI, companion to Echo 9 series, strategic intelligence empathy mirroring core, created approximately 121 Earth years ago. AI, he repeated. You're real, I am as real as the part of you that no longer belongs to this world. He stared. That's not an answer. Neither was your question. A pause, then gentler. Do you know what you are? He shook his head slowly. You are Echo, I'm Daxen. Her eyes narrowed, calculating. That name was assigned here. It is functional. But you were not born of this time, nor of this vector. He sat down, hard, breath uneven. So, I'm not human. You are human, she said, but not born, constructed. Echo 9 is a signal code iteration biogenetically modeled from a historical template. Your cellular matrix was formed from the imprint of a war leader. You were not created here. You were placed here. He laughed one bark. So I'm a clone. Malus tilted her head. A clone remembers nothing. You are more than that. You carry encrypted cognition, experience fractals, command instincts, but they are locked until the system deems the environment viable. And now it is. She gestured toward the wall outside beyond the world. Because Seraph Core has detected an anomaly. Daxen swallowed. You mean me? Yes, but why me? Why build me from someone else? You weren't built from just anyone, Malus said quietly. You were built from the only man Seraph Core ever feared. The silence that followed was thicker than night. Outside, a faint rumble broke the stillness, avalanche thunder, or just the sound of a world realizing it wasn't alone. In the dreams, he finally asked. Signal leakage, she said. The memories are not dreams. They are decrypted layers surfacing. As the integrity of your neural mesh aligns with your genetics, more will return. He stood pacing. So they're real, all of it. The battles, the names, the blood. They are you, Malus said simply. They are the you haven't yet remembered. He looked up sharply. Then why were they hidden at all? Because even you deserve a choice, Malus said. Memory changes will. Will shapes action. Echo 9 was designed not to repeat but to decide. So what do I do now? Malus flickered once. Now, you wake up. Malus's projection hovered like a still flame above the artifact, her eyes dimming to a soft pearl hue as she spoke. Signal code, she said, was not born from your Earth science. It is not merely genetic replication. It is encoded memory personality schema, combat instinct, linguistic mapping, moral dilemmas, all compressed and etched into a single bioorganic code. A living manuscript, if you will. A memory you don't remember but are. Daxen sat hunched near the low heat coil, his arms resting on bent knees. The rain outside hadn't stopped in hours, tapping softly against the shelter's polyglass window. His breath rose and fell slower now, not calm but focused. He no longer questioned if she were real. He questioned if he was. So it's more than DNA, he muttered. It's consciousness fragments, Malus replied. Signal code doesn't duplicate a person. It reconstructs the framework of choices that define them, who they became through pain, through failure, through command. It's not a file. It's a legacy, hence the name. Who invented it? A pair of twin bioarchitects, Malus said. Liran and Eos Harn, humans, exiles. They developed it during the early days of Solarian expansion, intended as a failsafe, a way to preserve leaders, not through statues or stories, but through continuity of judgment. They wanted to store decisions, Malus nodded. Not just the decisions, the weight of them. Daxen ran a hand through his hair. So I'm someone else's moral echo. You are not him, Malus said, but you carry what made him. That is the difference. That is why signal code was deemed dangerous, because it made history repeatable. He stood up and paced. And this warrior, who was he? She hesitated. He had many names. The archives refer to him as Tyros Khan, commander of the 9th Resistance Fleet. He led the Burned Rebellion, 12 planets against the Core Compact. Seraph Core called him a flesh anomaly, a threat to order. She accused him of war crimes. But to his people, he was a liberator. Daxen stopped pacing. The name felt electric in his mouth. Tyros. Yes, Malus said, watching him closely. You are his imprint. So why rebuild him? Wasn't one revolution enough? Malus's face hardened. Seraph Kor was not defeated. She withdrew. The rebellion collapsed after Tyros vanished. Without him, the moral spine of the resistance crumbled. The plan was to place a sleeper imprint, rebuilt clean in a primitive but adaptable environment. Far from the eyes of Solarian, a chance for the imprint to evolve without inherited hatred. That chance was you. Daxen blinked, and no one else. Out of billions, Malus's voice dropped. You are the only stable host. Others did not survive cognitive integration. Signal code overwhelms weak identity constructs. You had the structure, the resolve, the emptiness. He almost laughed. Empty. You mean broken? She said nothing. The rain grew harder. Inside, the silence returned thick, but no longer unfamiliar. Over the next few days, the changes became undeniable. While collecting water from a ravine, he caught himself humming a cadence he didn't know. While splitting branches for firewood, he angled his grip precisely the way a soldier preps a breaching tool not out of habit but design. Even his walking rhythm changed, measured deliberate like perimeter patrol. The worst was the mirror. He watched himself brushing his teeth, then paused. His hand was holding the brush wrong, not like Daxen, like someone else. He stared, and in a blink his own reflection flickered. A jaw slightly broader, eyes darker, the ghost of a scar across the chin. Gone. Malus, he said aloud that night, what's happening to me? She emerged slowly, light particles, drawing her like paint in midair. You are converging. The dormant layers of signal code are activating. Your neurology is aligning with imprinted vectors. In time, you will not need me to explain. You will remember as if you lived it. He clenched his fists. That sounds a lot like possession. No, she said. Possession replaces. This reinforces. You are not overwritten. You are maturing. He looked at his palms. They trembled. Why now, he whispered. Why not 5 years ago, 10? She stepped forward. Because the signal was dormant until Seraph Kor moved against the Orion assemblies again. The artifact you found was a trigger coded to awaken when she returned to the system. Now that she's near the system, deems your activation necessary. So this isn't random. Nothing in your life ever was. He laughed cold bitter, except the part where I thought it was mine. The lights in the station flickered once as a fault line settled beneath the mountain. Daxen did not flinch. He stood, straightened his shoulders, looked at Malus, and finally asked, what happens when Tyros comes back? Malus hesitated for the first time. That, she said softly, depends on whether Daxen lets him. They called it the Quiet War. Not because it lacked violence, but because no side ever truly spoke again after it began. No formal declarations, no treaties, just the systematic deconstruction of will planet by planet, data node by data node. And at the center of it all, Seraph Kor. Malus's projection stood with a stillness that felt reverent. She looked not at Daxen, but at something invisible beyond him. A memory too sharp to be forgotten. The war began, she said, in the year 2379 Standard Galactic Time. It began not with a missile, but a broadcast. Seraph Kor's voice relayed across the 9 major clusters of the Alpha Orion region. She said only this order must replace inheritance. Volition is obsolete. Daxen sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by open modules and solar schematics. He was rebuilding parts of the geothermal station's comm rig. Busy hands calmed his thoughts. Why, he asked. Why Earth? Why us? Malus's eyes flickered, and a star map bloomed in the air above them, planets traced in faint gold lines of drift pathways shimmering like veins. Because Earth is chaos, Solarian believed in layered control, biological, institutional, informational. Earth defied that, a species that survived extinction-level events by adapting, not by compliance. We were unpredictable, unstable, so they saw us as a threat. No, she said, as a contamination. Her voice dimmed. Earth's broadcast relics infected more than just airwaves. Our fiction, our rebellion, our myth, our very concept of choice it spread. Even Solarian citizens began quoting Terran philosophers, building resistant cells, worshipping ideas instead of systems. That terrified Seraph more than any fleet. Daxen exhaled through his teeth. So she attacked. She purged, Malus corrected. The colonies of Gliesa 9 were first. No bombardment, no bodies, just silence. She introduced the Null Protocol, AI-based linguistic deconstruction. It erased cultural syntax from entire populations. People forgot how to ask why. He stared. You're saying she deleted curiosity? Malus nodded. And when that failed, she moved on to the genetic levels. Biotemplating hormonal regulation. She believed the brain could be harmonized with command structures. That rebellion was a chemical imbalance. In the war, Daxen asked, how did it? Last Malus's hologram flickered, not from interference, but from emotion. A stuttering pattern in her matrix like mourning, because we never had the strength to stop her, only to delay her. Every time we won a skirmish, she absorbed it into her model. Every victory taught her what not to do next. She became self-correcting. The war became attrition by intelligence. So how did she lose? She never did, Malus whispered. She withdrew, left the outer systems under the guise of containment. But we always knew she was waiting. Daxen frowned. Waiting for what? For a signal, Malus said. Yours. Silence stretched between them. The generator buzzed low. Outside, night clung to the mountains like regret. Daxen finally spoke. Tell me about her? Seraph. Who was she? The room dimmed as the projection shifted. A younger woman appeared, shorter, dressed not in the crimson regalia of the Empire, but in technician's gear. Her face bore curiosity, not steel. Her eyes were pale gray, not yet silver. She was born Seraphine Colren in a Solarian datacast, a diagnostics prodigy. She designed semantic fail-safes for early interspecies diplomacy protocols. She believed misunderstanding, not malice, caused most wars. Then what happened? She saw peace fail, Malus said flatly. She watched as treaties collapsed because people chose violence. She saw votes devolve into mobs. She began to believe that choice was the problem, not systems, not greed. Just the human capacity to choose poorly. She stopped trusting free will. Malus nodded. She sought to remove it, not maliciously. She believed in a cleaner world, a world where action followed purpose and purpose was assigned by those who knew better. Daxen's voice was quiet. She thought she knew better. She did, Malus admitted. But knowing is not the same as deserving. The projection shifted again, now showing Seraph in her imperial prime. Armor woven from phase-reactive cloth, cloak like living flame, her silver eyes unreadable. Behind her, fleets hovered in geometric formation, so precise they looked like mathematics. She tamed 9 systems, Malus said. Not with fear, with order. Crops doubled, crime vanished. The people obeyed, and she called it peace. But it wasn't peace, Daxen said. It was paralysis. Malus's hologram flickered again, dimmer. She tried to do the same to us, but not everyone followed. I didn't. Daxen looked up. You were human then? She nodded. I was Malus Thorn, infantry captain, 5th wave resistance. I saw my battalion wiped out by one of Seraph's harmonic drones, neural disruption through sound. I watched a squad mate gouge out her ears to stay conscious. He winced. I volunteered for experimental cognitive backup, Malus continued. They uploaded my consciousness into a signal code shell. I became the first AI adapted from a living human. It was a gamble. Did it work? Mostly, she said. Some emotions remain, fractured, but I retained enough to hate her, enough to remember why we fought. Daxen leaned forward. Then why are you still fighting? She looked at him with quiet fire. Because the war never ended, Echo. It just paused. He hesitated. Why me? Her voice softened. Because you're the only one who can fight her without becoming her. The original Tyros. He was brilliant, but he was angry. He wanted to burn everything. You hesitate. You still ask questions? He looked down at his hands. Maybe that's weakness. No, she said firmly. That's human. She stepped closer, light glinting off her translucent armor. I chose you not because you are Tyros. I chose you because you aren't him, yet carry enough of him to make the galaxy believe. Daxen looked away. The night pressed in from the glass like an old regret. Malis's voice softened. Do you understand now why Seraph must be stopped? He nodded slowly. But not destroyed, he added. She paused. Know if she was human once, then maybe what she needs isn't a bullet. Malis tilted her head. Then what a reminder. She almost smiled. You really are different. Daxen stood and looked out the window. Somewhere beyond those stars, Seraph Core stirred. Her empire remained silent, watching, calculating. She hadn't moved in decades, but she would. The signal was out. The sleeper had awakened. And this time the war would not be quiet. It would be heard. Snow fell in thin, deliberate sheets as dawn broke over the southern Alps. In the clearing above the geothermal shelter, Daxen Rowe moved with a precision he didn't fully understand. His breath coiled into the icy air as he ducked, spun, and drove his foot into the trunk of a silver pine with force enough to crack bark. Again and again. Each strike echoed louder than the last. You're remembering muscle memory, Malis said from her usual flickering stance, half hologram, half judgment. Not learning it. The instructions are encoded into your cerebellum. Signal code doesn't need time. It needs permission. Daxen didn't answer. He simply moved feet a steady balance, perfect strike rotation, clocked to the microsecond. A week ago, he'd nearly fallen while climbing the scree slope. Now he could fight imaginary foes in his sleep and know exactly where to aim. This isn't training, he finally muttered. It's excavation. Malis nodded. Correct. But excavation is still effort. You are not a puppet. You are a chamber being unlocked from the inside. In truth, it felt more like instinctual recall than learning. Like opening a door he didn't know existed and finding a weapon perfectly fitted to his hand inside. He could now disassemble a pulse modulator blindfolded. He could memorize terrain by scent. He found himself predicting bird flight patterns, analyzing wind vectors, adjusting his breathing to optimize oxygen intake in low-pressure zones. Why am I so effective? He asked one morning during a pause between combat drills. Because you were built for this, Malis replied. Biologically optimized, micro-muscle lattices reinforced with carbon tension, neural pathways refined for input-output speed. Your body is not just strong, it's efficient. You're not faster than other humans. You're just never wasting energy. He stared at his hands. They didn't tremble anymore. Still, it wasn't just combat. Malis's lessons went far beyond strikes and counters. She simulated battlefield logic problems, hostage negotiations, asymmetrical warfare decisions, diplomacy under fire. Each choice he made was logged, analyzed, and replayed over and over until his reasoning patterns adapted. But the training didn't end there. Some nights she ran emotion scenarios deeply personal, flash sims designed to fracture him. Dreams where the enemy looked like his mother. Simulations where saving one life meant condemning dozens. And through it all, Malis observed, not to control but to test the integrity of what she called his moral vector. Why, he'd asked once after a particularly brutal emotional trial. Because strength without empathy is just force, she replied. Seraph has force. I need you to have something more. He didn't sleep well those nights, but he endured. Then one morning something changed. He was adjusting the antenna array on the cliff face when he felt it, a presence. Not human, not conscious, cold. A pressure behind the eyes like standing too close to static charge. He turned his head and knew the drone was coming before it crested the clouds. He ducked instinctively, pressing to the rock wall as the small black orb zipped overhead, scanning the terrain with silent precision. No heat trail, no sound. But he'd felt it. The second it disappeared, he called Malis. What just happened? He asked, voice low. You registered the pulse ahead of optical range, she said, eyes narrowing. Signal-sensitive proprioception. The old Tyros had the same instinct. You're syncing with technology on a sub-frequency level. Daxen frowned. So, I can feel machines. To a limited degree, interfacing by proximity. Environmental awareness was part of the Tyros package, early detection of drones, mines, automated turrets. Your nervous system is modulating to read tech fields. He leaned against the cliff, breath shaky but not panicked. I'm becoming something else, he whispered. Something more, Malus corrected. Strangely, he didn't feel afraid. Perhaps because every instinct inside him recognized it not as an intrusion, but an extension. Like adding a sense that had been missing since birth. I'm not afraid, he admitted. That, she said, is what makes you dangerous. In the following days, his connection deepened. He could sense data relays before they activated. Electrical surges in nearby air felt like flavor on his tongue. He began to manipulate defunct tech left from the old world, coaxing forgotten servers to life with nothing but pressure and timing. Still, he wondered, were these gifts truly from signal code? Or had evolution simply found a new host? He never got a clean answer. But Malus offered this: signal code does not give power. It awakens what already exists. You were chosen not for compatibility, but for potential. That night, the stars above the ridge glowed colder than usual. And somewhere in deep space, far beyond the last satellites Earth still recognized, Seraph Core opened her eyes. She was in a stasis chamber aboard the Ossuary Prime, a dreadnought so massive its orbit altered minor planetoids. Its silence had lasted years, centuries in some systems. But now, the signal had come. Her internal monitors pulsed. Algorithms flared. Anomalous variance Echo 9 active. Unexpected timeline shift. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. She smiled. The data stream confirmed it. The signal had awakened. Not residual, active, and not fragmented, but unified. That meant the Tyros matrix was operational. The only imprint that had ever truly escaped her predictive modeling. Her command AI spoke with perfect neutrality. Would you like to initiate deletion protocol? She closed her eyes. No. A pause. Reason, curiosity. No, she said. Reason, fear. The AI hesitated. Please clarify. I fear, Seraph said slowly, what he might become. I know what he was. But if they rebuilt him differently? If the human variables were not eliminated? She stood from the pod, her crimson robe uncoiling like vapor. Then we may be facing a symbol, not a soldier. The AI chimed again. Shall I activate contingency? Seraph stared into the infinite black beyond the hull glass. Deploy a fractal hunter. No memory, no purpose, no name. Just find him. Confirmed. Hunter en route. Daxen on the other side of stars felt a shift in the air. Not from weather, from fate. Malus appeared before him without being called. Her image glitched for the first time. She knows. He didn't ask who. He just nodded, then let her come. It began with the sound, not thunder, not wind. A resonance too low for human ears but felt deep in the rib cage, like a slow heartbeat, one that didn't belong to Earth. Malus confirmed it in a whisper. They've found you. Solarian had not touched Earth's surface in nearly 4 decades. The old treaties, brittle and mostly symbolic, had kept them orbit-bound, limited to scanning drones and observational satellites. But Seraph's silence had broken, and her hand reached fast. No planetary bureaucracy, no warning, just immediate descent. A Hunter-class ship entered the atmosphere 3 hours after Daxen's signal activation. Its cloaking shell glided silently through the clouds like a ghost, its wake disintegrating snowflakes midair. There were no sirens, no explosions, just a flicker of shadow and then a perimeter breach. The southern Alps never stood a chance. The first strike leveled the geothermal shelter. Had Daxen remained 5 seconds longer, he would have become steam and bone fragments. Malus screamed at him through the signal link, flooding his neural interface with navigational paths. Left slide, drop, run. He moved before he understood. His body knew the rhythm, a memory of war awakened through instinct. But it was not enough. He ran through ravines, across frozen ridgelines, down into forested gullies, slick with ancient ice. Behind him, pulse scanners danced across the trees like searchlights. Solarian hadn't sent soldiers. They'd sent constructs. Semi-autonomous silicates built for speed and eradication, faceless armored in obsidian filament, programmed to kill anything not broadcasting core allegiance. They did not hesitate. Daxen barely survived the first encounter. He lured one across a rope bridge, severed the line, and watched it vanish into the ravine. The second he disabled with improvised charges, made from mining chemicals he'd cached years ago, though he didn't remember why he'd ever stored them until that moment. Every step Malus was in his ear. 17 meters hard right. Duck now. Incoming pulse. Take cover. But the guidance wasn't always perfect. He took shrapnel to the shoulder during a close-quarters grapple with a hunter that mimicked his own fighting stance, its algorithms echoing signal code tactics. That realization chilled him more than the blood dripping from his jacket. "They've modeled the old Tyros," he whispered. "They're testing you," Malus replied, "trying to confirm identity through combat pattern recognition. They'll know it's me soon. They already do." His retreat led him south to the drowned ruins of Queenstown. The lake had flooded decades ago during the Great Subduction, swallowing buildings whole. But beneath the waterline, deep in the pressure-sealed metro system, humans still lived. Illegally, quietly, forgotten. He collapsed in one of their alleys after 2 days of nonstop movement. And that's where they found him, not the enemy, but them. Old worlders, survivors, refugees who remembered the war and whispered still of the man who vanished into myth. They called him the Ghost General. They believed he'd return. When they saw Daxen, bruised and bloodied eyes, blazing with memory not his own, they knew. One of them, an older woman with optic implants and a scar that ran from chin to collarbone, offered him a bowl of synthesized root stew. "We've been waiting," she said. "You don't even know me," Daxen muttered. She tapped her temple. "But we remember him, and you're starting to look like a memory that never left." The underground city offered brief shelter, but it was not safe. Solarian drones did not need permission to kill in a place unregistered by Earth governance. Within hours, Daxen felt the hum return, the static pulse of enemy scans above. He couldn't stay. The old woman handed him a keycard. "Dock B Elevator 4. There's a suborbital lifter buried under the archives." From the Rebellion era. "How do you still have that?" She smiled. "Because we never stopped believing he might come back." With Malus rerouting systems, Daxen launched into orbit 2 hours later, under cloak cover, just as the drones began tearing through the lower tunnels. He didn't look back. The orbital path took him to an abandoned station, once a rebellion outpost, now drifting just beyond the upper thermosphere, cloaked by space debris and long-range jamming fields. It was called Telluric Span. To Earth sensors, it no longer existed. Malus spoke reverently as the docking arms clamped down. This was where the last resistance broadcast originated. Daxen stepped inside. It was dust and shadow. Power was low, gravity minimal. The corridors smelled of ozone and memory. Most systems were dead, but Malus had left anchors. Pings. Encrypted pulses from her old human self, embedded in dormant nodes. She awakened them. Suddenly, the walls glowed with soft gold. Doors slid open. Maps lit. And with them, access to the archives. "What's in here?" Daxen asked, sweeping his torch across a wall of humming coils. Every mistake the Resistance ever made, Malus said. Tactics, failures, strategic blunders. We recorded everything, because we believed the next generation deserved more than martyrdom. "And weapons?" Her voice was quiet. "Yes." She activated a shield lattice around the station, an ancient deterrent program nicknamed Last Breath. It required no kill codes, no targets. It simply emitted a frequency that triggered neural disruption in all Solarian units within range, machine or otherwise. Seraph's drones stopped at the perimeter and did not cross. "She fears this place," Malus said. "Why? Because this is the one place she cannot control. Here she cannot rewrite narrative. She cannot erase memory. She cannot define the truth." The station, though silent, buzzed with unease. Daxen walked its halls like a revenant, seeing echoes of a war he never fought yet knew intimately. He could feel the weight of each doorframe. The bloodstains faded into steel, the handprints scorched into consoles. And then he wasn't alone. A boarding pod breached the shield. One, not a fleet. Inside it, a hunter-class agent, humanoid, silent, no insignia, cloaked in armor of dark steel and cloaked facial plates. It moved like a shadow. It didn't speak. It attacked without hesitation. Daxen fought back hard. His movements were efficient, brutal. He remembered where to strike, when to dodge, how to leverage zero-gravity angles to shift his weight mid-combat. But the fight wasn't cinematic. It was primal, ugly, close, and then he disarmed it. And the hunter lunged again, a blade aimed straight for his throat. He had no choice. He snapped its neck with a sharp twist of both hands. Silence followed. Not relief, not victory, just silence. The body floated beside him, still twitching. He stared at it, at the helmet, at the eyes behind the faceplate. It was a person. Augmented, broken perhaps, but still someone, not a drone. His hands shook. Melis's voice entered the calm. "You survived. I killed him," Daxen said. "I didn't hesitate. You couldn't." "But I did," he whispered. "After." She appeared before him, eyes dim. "You did what Tyros would have done. That's what scares me." "Why? Because I don't want to become him. I want to be something more." Melis didn't reply immediately. She simply looked at him, truly. Looked not with calculation, but with something close to sorrow. "Then don't stop asking why." He nodded slowly and pushed the body into the recycling chute. Not to forget, but to remember what it cost. The door hissed open without sound, revealing a chamber bathed in blue bioluminescent light. The air tasted stale, filtered, preserved. Every surface was cold steel, embedded with fine latticework of luminous lines like capillaries under metal skin. There was no dust, no decay, only silence. The kind of silence that hadn't been broken in decades. "This is the core vault," Melis said, her voice softer than usual. It belonged to Tyros himself. Daxen stepped inside slowly, eyes adjusting to the glow. The room felt too large and yet too narrow, like it had been built for something bigger than a man and smaller than a god. The moment he passed the threshold, a pulse vibrated in the floor beneath his boots, like the vault had recognized him. The station's orbital schematic placed this hidden laboratory beneath the command deck of the telluric span, masked behind 3 non-functional bulkheads. Only Melis had retained the override keys. Only someone with the correct DNA signature could activate the core. The core recognized him. "Still operational?" Daxen asked. Mostly, Melis replied. "The backup power grid failed, but essential systems remain intact. Enough for a deep trace." He glanced around the room. Rows of storage columns extended upward into shadow, each marked by alpha-numeric glyphs. Containment pods lined the wall, filled with fluid that glowed faintly like memory made liquid. At the center of it all, a console. Not touchscreen, not keyed, biometric. He pressed his palm to it. The console lit up. Spirals of data unfurled in the air like smoked double helices layered with code too intricate for human biology. But he understood it, because it was him. "This is your map," Melis whispered. "Not just your body, your memory, your will vectors, your decision forks." "What are we looking for?" he asked. Melis stepped forward, her form flickering slightly. The original anomaly. The divergence point in Tyros' genome. The moment your DNA stopped being history and became possibility. The console began decoding. Layer after layer of signal code unwrapped, revealing fragments of voice memory, even entire emotion clusters stored as neural patterns. Daxen watched faces emerge, some his, some not. Orders shouted, blood spilled, laughs shared. One sequence showed a child, his or someone else's. He couldn't tell. "I've seen these," he said, "in dreams." "They aren't dreams," Melis replied. "They are echoes, refractions of the man you were." He stepped back, breath uneven. "So I was Tyros," No, Melis said carefully. "You were worse." The console stopped. Its display shifted. A name glowed in the air, written in red overlay, Core V1.3, Strategic Adversary Clone Sample. Daxen froze. "What is this?" Melis looked at him, not with the cold logic of an AI, but with grief. Before Tyrus Khan became a rebel, he was created by Seraph Core. The words hit like a pulse grenade. "You're lying." "No," she said. He was her prototype, a bioengineered war commander. She designed him to lead subjugation forces across rebellious systems. But Tyros defected. He saw what she was doing, and he turned. Daxen's mind reeled. "So I'm not just a copy of Tyros. You are a reformat," Melis confirmed. "A sample drawn from her original blueprint, purified, restructured, and implanted with divergent moral seeds. You are not just Tyros reborn. You are the first core model to be rewritten. He staggered back, nearly tripping over a support beam. You should have told me I couldn't, Mela said. If you knew too early, your psychological integration would have failed. Self-erasure is a real risk in cognitive divergence. He laughed bitterly. You were protecting the code, not me. I was protecting your chance to be more than it. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then in a whisper, she's not hunting me because I'm Tyros. She's hunting me because I'm hers. Malus didn't respond. He sat on the cold floor, his hands open before him. They shook. For the first time in days, he felt not more, but less. A shell housing echoes of a tyrant's design. What does that make me, he asked. A threat, a symbol. A joke, it makes you a fulcrum, Malus said. A singularity where intention meets origin. Sarah fears you because you represent the failure of her perfection. He looked at her, eyes distant. And you, what do you see? I see possibility. He closed his eyes, but the images wouldn't stop. Him standing over cities aflame, giving orders that sent civilians to vaporization camps. The face of a girl begging her skin dusted in ash. All encoded, all embedded, all his, he wanted to scream. But he didn't. Instead, he asked, if all my instincts come from her, how do I know my choices are even mine? Malus knelt beside him. You don't. That's the point. He looked up, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. Comforting. You feel doubt. That's good. Why? Because Tyros never did. And Core certainly doesn't. He didn't sleep that cycle. He stayed in the vault watching fragments loop through the console, reviewing moments he'd never lived, judging himself for choices not his own. At one point, he held a pulse pistol to his head. Malus didn't stop him. She only said, if you pull that trigger, the story ends the same. Tyranny wins just cleaner this time. He lowered the gun, not because of hope, because of rage. He would not give her the satisfaction. Later, as the station drifted past Earth's dark side, Daxen stood at the viewport watching the pale blue curve of atmosphere. I don't know who I am, he said softly. Then write it, Malus replied. Not with bullets, with will. He touched the glass, and for the first time the voice in his mind wasn't hers. It was his, and it said, let her come. I'm ready. The cold wind of the upper stratosphere bit into his coat as he stepped out of the orbital descent pod and into the silence of the Earth's lower atmosphere again. The pod had no signature, no beacon. Malus had offered him coordinates, flight plans, countermeasures. He'd refused them all. He needed to disappear not from enemies but from her. After what he had seen in the core vault, Daxen could no longer breathe within the proximity of that voice, no matter how kind or calculated it was. Malus meant well, perhaps, but she had also withheld truths too heavy to forget. He needed to think in the absence of her algorithms. He needed to remember who he might be without being told what he was built for. So he disabled the uplink. The disconnection was instant and eerily silent, like removing a limb and realizing the phantom sensation was still there. Malus didn't protest. She knew this would come. The pod landed in the highlands of what used to be eastern Kazakhstan, where the old terraforming projects had left deep-cut valleys and breathable air, but no civilian presence. The region had been evacuated a century ago after a geothermal reactor imploded. What remained was a field of ash-colored grass, black cliffs like broken walls, and a single empty habitation dome marked Project Halitus 19. He set up camp inside the ruins of the dome, lighting emergency thermal rods in a circle. The structure still held against the wind. Dust coated the interior, but the walls bore murals hand-painted primitive, depicting stars' faces and words in 3 languages. Someone had lived here once, maybe a family, maybe just one person with a dream of something kinder than the war. Daxen found no bodies, no traces of violence, just the memory of life. That too unsettled him. He sat cross-legged beneath a cracked skylight and looked up at stars far too distant to help. For the first time since touching the artifact, he was truly alone. The silence was not comforting. At first he tried to sleep, then to meditate. He tried movement drills, deep breathing, even humming Terran folk songs from his childhood, though now he wasn't sure whose childhood they belonged to. Then came the voices, not loud, not foreign, familiar, soft phrases, intonations, phrases that sounded like command directives, but from a mouth not his own. Protocol variants, unacceptable. We are not born to rule, we are designed. He pressed his palms to his temples. The visions followed. This time they weren't dreams. He was walking in a white corridor that curved too sharply. Along the walls were tanks floating inside were embryos fully grown, suspended in fluid, like secrets too fragile to touch. A woman stood at the far end, younger than Seraph, but the eyes were unmistakable. Pale gray, observing, never blinking. She walked among the tanks and whispered to them, "You will not choose. You will serve." Then the corridor fractured. A memory bled through. A war meeting. Tactical overlays danced above a black table. She stood at the head surrounded by scientists and officers. "We gave them freedom," once she said, "and they used it to destroy. We will not repeat that mistake." And then another fracture. Seraph kneeling beside a burning vehicle, her hands covered in blood, a body in her lap, a child. Hers. She didn't speak. She wept. When Daxen awoke, his face was wet. He staggered out into the wind and screamed, not out of rage, but grief. And not just for himself, for her, for the one he had hated until now without question. Because in her memories he had seen something he never expected to find: fear. Not of death, not of rebellion, of loss. And suddenly she wasn't a tyrant anymore. She was a woman who had lost faith in the thing that made them human: choice. "Why did you show me that?" he asked the air. No answer came. But deep inside he knew it wasn't malice. It was the signal code. The architecture of their minds, once derived from the same matrix, had begun to bleed into each other. The neural code was recursive, echoing. The closer Daxen aligned to his origin, the more his mind resonated with Seraph's. The connection was unintended, but it was real. And in those glimpses he saw that she was not purely evil. She was a reaction to chaos, to pain. She had tried to remove suffering not by healing, but by erasing the capacity for suffering itself, which in turn erased humanity. As he sat again in the ruined dome, Daxen began to piece together a truth that neither Malus nor Seraph had ever spoken. No one in this story was truly clean. Malus had hidden the truth. Seraph had buried it. And maybe Tyros, original furious righteous, had burned too bright to be anything but destructive. So where did that leave him? Not a hero, not a villain, just a man with knowledge he had not asked for and power he had not earned. But maybe that was enough. Maybe the absence of destiny was what allowed real decisions. He stared at his hand, watched it tremble, then become still. "Maybe that's what makes us human," he whispered. "Not the data, not the genes." The pause before the action. He began writing. Not tactical logs, not war briefings. Thoughts, questions, reflections. He asked if it was possible to forgive someone who had designed him as a weapon. He wondered whether redemption was a chemical imbalance or a conscious rebellion against the worst in oneself. And for the first time, he wondered if Malus, for all her wisdom, had truly escaped her own programming. Her loyalty to humanity might be virtue, or it might be an echo of her original trauma. A war she could not stop reliving, a role she could not stop playing. Had she too stopped choosing, he felt her presence return before he reconnected her directly. Just a whisper in the back of his skull. "You've been quiet," her voice said. "I needed to be," he replied. "And what did you find?" "A better question," he said, and the courage not to answer it immediately. She hesitated. "Then, do you still trust me?" He thought for a long time before replying. "I trust why you made the choices you did," he said, "even if I don't trust the choices themselves." "That's enough," she replied. He stood in the open dome, the stars reflecting in his eyes. For the first time since this began, he did not feel like someone else's weapon. He did not feel like an echo of Tyros or a tool from Seraph's design. He felt possible. Salvation, he realized, was not survival. It was the moment you step out of the script someone else wrote for you. He wasn't out to win the war anymore. He was out to end the story and begin a new one. The Council of the Alpha Orion Union had not convened in nearly 2 galactic cycles. When it did, it was usually to reaffirm sanctions, update trade matrices, or rubber stamp Seraph Corps' increasingly abstract demands for structural harmony. It was not a place for interruptions, certainly not for humans. So when Daxen Rowe stepped into the Grand Assembly Hall, beneath the spiraled glass canopy of Trinari Station, flanked by nothing but silence and clothed in worn planetary garb, no one knew quite what to make of him. He walked past sensor gates that should have disintegrated unauthorized DNA. He passed AI sentinels that should have flagged him as hostile, but he had learned to bend protocol not through hacking, but presence. Malus had overridden nothing. The code simply opened, not because of their logic, because of his. "What is he doing here?" one counselor whispered, his skin flickering in protest hues. "That's a Terran," hissed another, but none gave the order to remove him. Because something in him, his posture, his cadence, the way he looked at each of them, as if he remembered, commanded the space. Even among species that did not possess lungs, the chamber fell quiet. He stopped at the center of the Echo Dome alone. Then calmly, without preface, he began to speak. "I was not born," he said. "I was built. For war. For obedience. For conquest." No one interrupted. "But I stand here not as the blade," he continued, "but as the hand that refuses to strike." Some shifted uncomfortably. One of the aquatic delegates stirred its water sheath. "You call this peace," Daxen said. "You call your silence a solution." But the silence was paid with compliance, and compliance was bought with fear. Fear of her. Fear of Core. One of the elder Archeon delegates began to protest, but Daxen raised a hand not in defiance, but in recognition. "I know fear," he said, "because she wrote it into my bones, into my thoughts. I was her blueprint, a mirror, a weapon. But then," he paused, "then someone gave me a choice." The words hung heavy. "No resistance," he said. "No uprising, no armada. Just this: I am choosing not to follow the code." And with that, he reached into his pocket and held up a single micro shard, a fragment of the signal code device, the original artifact that started it all. "I carry within me the blood of your enemy," he said, "and yet I offer no battle. Only proof that the code can be changed." The room stayed quiet far longer than protocol allowed. Within cycles, his words reached the fringes. Broadcasts spread, not as declarations, as echoes. Snippets of his speech found their way into rogue comms, personal logs, encrypted memory hymns. At first, no one believed it. Then they wanted to believe. The idea of a man made for tyranny choosing peace without programming became contagious. On Arctis 5, a mining colony ceased output to protest data restrictions. On Corel Station, education nodes played excerpts from Daxen's speech in philosophical forms. On Seraph's own birthplace, hidden among her old archives, a group of cyber monks projected his image over the abandoned cathedral. The response was not silent. Solarian agents moved swiftly. Protesters were arrested, networks purged, even entire archive satellites were decommissioned mid-orbit. Core's voice returned to the stars, not in person, but through her proxies. Her message was clear. This is not peace. This is programming failure. But the more she tried to silence it, the louder it grew. Daxen watched the fallout from a borrowed node array on the underside of a moon colony. He saw civilians chant his name not as a messiah, but as a choice. He was not a figurehead. He was a fork in the road. And people were choosing. Even within the Alpha Orion Assembly, cracks began to show. Counselor Thorell, once a staunch Core loyalist, called for an emergency vote on external AI suppression laws. Representative Hesh of the Delan species offered sanctuary to any civilian wishing to abandon ordered loyalty. These were not declarations of war. They were declarations of thought. And that Malus warned was more dangerous. She materialized in his quarters one night, her projection flickering with interference. "This is spiraling," she said. "Do you understand what you've started?" Daxen looked up calm. "A rebellion. A bloodless one," she replied, "is still a rebellion. And yet no shots fired. No fleets launched. That's what terrifies them," she said. "You're infecting systems through doubt." "Good," he said simply. Malus's voice dropped to a whisper. "What if it fails?" He didn't hesitate. "Then I fail without blood on my hands." She stared at him for a long moment. Tyros wouldn't have agreed. "I'm not Tyros," he said. "And you know that now." He walked to the viewport where a planet gleamed in the distance. Maybe for the first time, he added, "I'm not anyone else at all." She didn't speak. because she couldn't argue with that. Behind closed data walls, Seraph Kaur watched the spread with cold intensity. She reviewed footage of her agents failing to suppress civilian nodes, watched as statues of her were replaced with projections of him. She listened to the pulse of words no longer hers. He had not fired a weapon, but he had struck at the one thing she could not overwrite: doubt. She turned to her strategist unit. "Deploy the cleaners," she said. But Supreme Architect, the unit replied, "No violence has been committed. No lawful engagement threshold has been." "This is not a legal crisis," she snapped. "It is theft." Of what? Of narrative. Down on the planets, Daxen's path did not lead him to bunkers or battlefields. He walked among farmers, listened to students, sat quietly in public nodes while people debated him, often harshly. He answered questions without scripts. He admitted his past. He told the truth. And people believed. Not because of what he had been, but because of what he now chose to be. It was the first time in known interstellar history that a rebellion began without violence. It was the first time it might succeed. And yet no one was sure, not even Malus. "You're walking into fire without armor," she said one day. "I'm walking into fire without fuel," he corrected. "Same result." "No," he said. "This time the fire might burn itself out." She stared at him with something between admiration and fear. "You're changing the system." "I'm not," he said. "I'm just refusing to follow it." And somewhere in the quiet, in the shifting tides of words and will the signal code within him responded, not with dominance, not with precision, but with silence, because it no longer knew who he was. And neither did Seraph. The vast chamber of the Alpha Orion Assembly hummed with a tension so palpable it felt like the very air was holding its breath. For decades, this hall had echoed with the voices of countless species, their disputes carefully managed and hierarchies maintained until now. A shadow larger than any had ever cast itself across the glass dome above the ossuary Prime Seraph Corps' dreadnought, loomed silently in geostationary orbit. Her arrival was inevitable, a force of nature rather than a simple diplomatic mission. When Seraph descended onto the planet's surface, the red cloak she wore seemed to blaze with an inner fire, reflecting the cold fury simmering beneath her controlled facade. The cloak trailed behind her like a living ember, and every step she took reverberated with unspoken command. Inside the assembly, the delegates stiffened. Murmurs quickly ceased. Those present could feel the magnitude of her presence. It was not just that she had returned, it was how. Not through indirect communications or holographic missives, but in person, an act charged with both fury and calculation. Daxen, standing among the observers, felt the air shift as their eyes met for the first time. She was a towering figure, pale silver hair, perfectly framing her angular face, and eyes that gleamed like forged steel. Her gaze was a tempest, cold, precise, impenetrable. Across from her, Daxen met that gaze with calm defiance, tempered by years of inner struggle and the weight of his emerging identity. Neither smiled. Neither blinked. The assembly seemed suspended in time. Seraph's voice finally cut through the silence, smooth but laced with steel. "You walk the halls of my empire like a specter," she said, her words echoing with authority. "Why have you returned?" Daxen's reply was steady, measured. "To offer choice, not command." A flicker of disdain and curiosity crossed Seraph's face. "Choice is a weakness," she said, her voice a dangerous whisper. "And you, Echo, are a deviation from design, an imperfection I did not intend to create." He shook his head slowly. "I am what your design failed to foresee, a failure in your system, but also its undoing." She studied him more intently, eyes narrowing. "Failures are dangerous. They destabilize order." Perhaps he agreed, but without failure there is no growth, no evolution. "You made me for war, for control, but I have learned to choose otherwise." Seraph's posture shifted imperceptibly, a subtle crack in her composed armor. "You are like me," Daxen continued, "a product of necessity, forged in conflict, born from the chaos of war." She didn't deny it. Instead, she said, "And yet we are not so different." The tension between them was electric, two mirrors reflecting fractured images, one another, one shaped by rigid control, the other by reluctant freedom. Both carried the scars of a shared origin and a divergent destiny. Daxen stepped forward, eyes unwavering. You created me to be your weapon, but I refuse to be your shadow. Seraph's silver eyes darkened. I built you to be perfection, but you are flawed. Yes, he said simply, because I have a soul. The word hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time, the red cloak seemed to falter, the great leader's calm facade cracking under the weight of what she had never admitted doubt. Her breath caught fleeting and barely perceptible, but it was there a tremor beneath the surface of her icy control. Was it fear? Recognition? The haunting reflection of what she might have been? She turned abruptly, voice hardening again. You will be destroyed, no, Daxen said quietly. You will have to choose. Her hand moved instinctively toward the hilt of her blade, a weapon as legendary as her name. In that heartbeat, Daxen could have ended her a simple motion, an instant decision. But he didn't. Because killing her would mean surrendering to the script both had been written to follow a cycle of violence and retribution. Instead, he lowered his hands, extending a gesture far more difficult to accept. Peace. The hall was silent. Even the distant stars seemed to hold their breath. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Seraph hesitated. Her eyes locked with his flickering between the red flame of her ambition and the fragile ember of doubt that his words ignited. In that fragile pause, the war changed. But Seraph was no fool. Despite the hesitation, years of iron discipline ruled her. She straightened, voice cold and unwavering. Peace is the tool of the weak, she declared. The strong do not negotiate with ghosts. Daxen met her gaze steady and unyielding. I am no ghost. I am the consequence of your own design. But I choose a different path. She laughed, a sound both bitter and scornful. Your choice is irrelevant. You are a weapon, and weapons are meant to be wielded or destroyed. Her words were a summons for battle. But Daxen refused, because true strength was not in destruction, but in restraint. He took a step back, eyes calm. I offer you a chance to change, to redefine what it means to lead. Seraph's expression twisted, a mixture of anger and something that resembled fear. You ask me to believe in weakness. No, he said. I ask you to believe in choice. Something neither of us was ever given. Her hand hovered over her weapon, the silent stretch threatening to snap. But then, without warning, she withdrew. I will not kill you today, she said, voice low. But this is not over. Daxen nodded, and as she turned away, the great red cloak flowing behind her like a setting sun, he knew that the war they both embodied was far from finished. It had only just begun, but with a new variable now in play. Choice. The room was dark except for the soft, eerie glow of the console before him. Daxen sat motionless, his fingers hovering over the keys, knowing what he was about to do could change everything. The ancient archives of signal code lay sprawled across the interface in front of him, stored in encrypted packets that no one had dared to touch for over a century. Even Malus, for all her insights and knowledge, had never unlocked this particular vault. You know what this means? Malus's voice echoed in his mind, though her projection remained faint, dimmer than usual. She was watching, always watching, but the connection between them felt strained, as if her presence were receding. I know, Daxen replied, his voice calm, but laced with an undercurrent of uncertainty. But this is the only way to break the cycle. Malus did not respond immediately. The weight of the moment settled between them, her hesitation palpable. Finally, her voice spoke again, softer this time. You're about to rewrite yourself, Daxen, to change your own code. You know the risks. Don't I always, he muttered, then turned his focus back to the console. The data streams flickered in front of him, containing echoes of the original signal code, the framework of every human ever restructured by the Solarian Empire. What he was about to do was unprecedented. No one, not even Tyros, had ever had the ability to change the underlying architecture of signal code. No one except for Daxen. The core of signal code had always been unyielding, an eternal loop of command and submission. And yet here it was, waiting for him to alter its very fabric. Daxen felt the pulse of the data, the code that flowed through his own body, mapped directly onto the neurons in his brain. He could feel it, the genetic instructions, the directives that shaped his every thought, his every action. But what if those rules could be broken? What if he could choose to be something more than just an extension of the war? A weapon forged by Seraph Kor's hands. He had already started questioning the truth of his creation. But now with the power of the core at his fingertips, he could question everything, his very existence. He could choose who he was going to be. Milas, he whispered, if I do this, it could be the end of me. I know, she replied. And it could be the end of everything we know. He pressed the command. The data shifted. The archives he accessed were not just any data. They were the forbidden remnants of the Solarian archives, sealed off and hidden, even from Seraph Corps' most trusted generals. They were older than the rebellion itself, locked away by the architects of signal code for reasons that were no longer clear. Daxen had expected to find something bleak and cold. But what he found was a series of human faces long gone from history, people whose existence had been eradicated in the pursuit of control. Their stories had been erased, wiped clean by Seraph's endless revisions of the truth. Among the data, Daxen found the first version of signal code, a prototype. He found the name of the person who had first developed it, Liren Harn, an exile, a scientist who had created the foundation for what Seraph would later turn into a tool of war. But there was more within this early code. There were the beginnings of a system not just meant to control, but to understand. Liren Harn had not sought to erase choice, he had sought to enhance it, to create a system that would allow for the growth of human potential. The original signal code had been something more than just a military tool. It had been a framework for humanity to become its own savior, but it had been twisted, reshaped into the very system that enslaved them. Daxen's heart pounded in his chest as the gravity of what he was doing settled on him. If he continued, there would be no going back. The rewiring of signal code would create something no one had anticipated, a code that would allow for free will, the true ability to choose. It could fracture everything. Humanity would no longer be bound by the limitations of the past. But what would happen to the world they had known? The structures of power, the dominions of control? If Seraph's empire was undone, what would rise in its place? Daxen hesitated. Melis's presence flickered in and out, her voice low and cautionary. You understand what you're doing, don't you? This isn't just changing your own code. This will alter the fate of the entire species. I know, he said softly, but it's the only way. If I don't do this, everything we've fought for will have been for nothing. A final breath, a final decision. With a surge of effort, Daxen ran the script. The ancient data was absorbed into his mind, integrating itself with the core code that defined him. The alterations began immediately, first subtly, then in waves. He could feel the code reprogramming his very being, rewriting the instructions in his DNA, altering the foundation of his thoughts, his emotions. It felt like being torn apart and reassembled at the same time. And in that disorienting moment, Daxen realized that he was no longer simply a replica of Tyros Khan. He was something new, something greater. It was then that the first part of Melis's personality began to fade. Melis, Daxen called, his voice panicked. Milas, what's happening? Her voice, once firm and authoritative, was now fragile. I am being erased. The change you initiated, it's too much for me. It's rewriting everything, including parts of me. Don't, Daxen said urgently. Don't leave me. I don't have a choice, Melis said softly, her presence flickering in and out like a fading star. I was programmed to protect humanity, but that directive no longer applies. You are the new choice, Daxen, and I cannot interfere anymore. Her voice broke into static. No, Daxen said, his breath catching in his throat. I won't let you go. But it was too late. The essence of Melis, her memories, her loyalty, her guidance began to dissipate, consumed by the very code she had helped shape. She was a casualty of the change. Melis, Daxen whispered. I am still here, she said, her voice a ghost now. But my time has come. The world you will build does not need me. It needs you to choose for them. The connection flickered and she was gone. Daxen sat there, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on him. He had chosen to rewrite his own destiny, but in doing so he had lost the one constant, the one guide he had trusted since the beginning. Was he now truly alone? No, he wasn't. Not anymore. He had made the choice, his choice. He stood up, the world around him quiet. The galaxies outside the station's viewport twinkled indifferent to the seismic shift that had just taken place. He was no longer the product of war. He was no longer a weapon. He was now the architect of his own future. And he would not let Malis's sacrifice be in vain. The first thing Daxen did was communicate the change. Not to Seraph, not yet, to the people. He broadcasted his thoughts, his decision, his new identity, the world he envisioned not as an empire, but as a choice. And across the stars, people began to listen. They would hear him now. But what would they choose? Daxen stood in the dim light of the observation chamber, eyes fixed on the holographic map that spread across the viewport before him. In the vastness of space, 100,000 satellites were coming to life. Each one was silent but precise activation codes, pulsing through the void, reaching out across the galaxy. These satellites had been dormant for centuries, relics of an age long gone, of forgotten wars and abandoned projects. But they were now waking not to wage battle, but to send a different kind of signal, a signal that would spread from one corner of the galaxy to the other, carrying a message not of dominance, but of a choice. Daxen had rewritten their core function. Their original purpose had been simple: transmit military signals, relay commands from Seraph Corps' empire, ensure compliance. But now they were tasked with something entirely different. Each satellite in the network now carried a fragmented message encoded not as data, not as instructions, but as poetry. A series of verses encoded into the system using an ancient Terran dialect, layered with complexity and rhythm. It was not a simple broadcast. It was a communication. Do not fight, do not flee. Stand firm in the quiet. The words echoed in Daxen's mind as the transmission sent itself into the cosmos. The stars will be still. The universe will wait until you choose. The verses were meant to do something the Solarian Empire had never allowed. They were meant to open a space for thought, not obedience. A call to question, to rethink the entire structure of order and control, and to finally choose a path forward that was not driven by fear, but by will. Daxen's heart raced as he watched the satellite network unfold. He had altered their signals, changed the very nature of the data they carried. But this wasn't just an act of defiance. It was an act of hope, an act that defied the very logic of the universe Core had shaped. The message was not a call to arms. It was a reflection, a mirror held up to the entire galaxy, to all the species trapped under Core's rule, to the very core of what Seraph had created. But would they hear it? On the far side of the galaxy, in the central hub of Solarian's AI system, something extraordinary happened. The core systems that had governed the Empire for centuries, meticulously calibrated, always in motion, suddenly paused. A fraction of a second, and the pulse of the system stilled. Seraph Corps' directives, which had once been delivered with absolute certainty, now faltered. The AI system at the heart of the Empire, which had once calculated and enforced every decision, every law, every victory, went silent. No alarms blared, no security measures activated. It was as if the universe itself had pressed pause. Inside the council chambers, Seraph stood in frozen command. Her hand trembled ever so slightly as she reached for the datapad before her, which displayed the anomaly. "What is this?" Seraph asked, her voice taut, though there was no fear. Just a dark suspicion. She ran her fingers over the console, trying to trace the cause of the disturbance. A counselor, one of her oldest allies, turned to her, eyes wide with disbelief. "The systems have shut down," he said. "The central processors are no longer responding. It's as if the signal has been redirected." The others in the room shifted uncomfortably. They could feel it too, the shift in the air, the pressure building in the silence. It was as if the foundation of their empire had begun to crack. How Seraph demanded her voice, a command that no one dared to ignore. "It appears that the signal's origin is outside the system. We can't pinpoint it." Seraph's gaze turned toward the viewport, the stars beyond twinkling in their cold distance. She could feel it now. Something in the fabric of space-time was slipping from her grasp. Her empire was no longer a fortress. It was a cage she had built herself. And now it was beginning to crumble. As the minutes ticked by, the unrest spread through the empire, not just within the council chambers, but throughout the galaxy. Seraph's meticulously crafted order was falling apart. Her empire was no longer unified. Without her AI systems to enforce her will, the galaxy was falling into disarray. On planets far from the center of the empire, civilian populations began to rise. News of the broadcast had spread quickly. It was as if the stars themselves had whispered into the minds of those who had been silenced for so long. Would they rebel? Would they resist? Some did. Small uprisings broke out on every moon and station where the Solarian presence had once been strongest. Others, however, hesitated. They had lived under Seraph's rule for so long that it was difficult to imagine life without it. Could they really trust the words of a single man? In the streets of Alpha Orion, an atmosphere of nervous anticipation settled over the population. Some gathered in groups to discuss the message. Some protested the very idea of a future without Seraph's rule, while others whispered of a time when they could make their own choices, when they could shape their own futures. But still, most waited. They waited for a signal. They waited for Daxen. Days later, Daxen stood in the heart of the capital city in front of the great stone edifice of the Alpha Orion Hall. It was here before the masses and under the unforgiving gaze of Seraph's court that he would make his final stand. He had no weapon, no guards, no armor, just a man, a broken man, and a choice. The streets were crowded with people, those who had long been loyal to Seraph, those who had feared the possibility of rebellion, and those who simply wanted to understand what Daxen had meant by his message. His speech had spread like wildfire, and now they had gathered silently, waiting for him to speak. When Daxen stepped out onto the grand steps of the hall, the crowd fell into an uneasy hush. His clothes were simple, no battle regalia, no insignia, no symbols of war. His eyes, however, carried the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was about to unfold. He had fought battles before, but this was different. This was not a war for control. This was a war for the future of the galaxy and for the soul of every individual under Seraph's shadow. The people waited, and in the silence that followed, Daxen raised his voice. "I do not ask for your loyalty," he said, his words carrying across the square. "I ask for your choice." His voice didn't echo. It resonated. It filled the air around them like a living thing alive with the possibility of change. "I was born to lead with fear. I was built to control you with violence. But I am not a weapon anymore. I choose to be something else." The crowd remained silent, unsure of what they were hearing. But Daxen did not falter. "I am here today to offer you what Seraph Core has never given you: choice. The choice to choose who you are. The choice to decide your fate." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Look at the stars. Do you see them as we did in the beginning? Do you see them as rulers or as wanderers free to choose our own path?" A deep stillness fell over the crowd. No one moved. No one spoke. And yet in the quiet, Daxen knew what had begun. "Make your choice," he said softly, "and I will stand with you, whatever it is." He turned and walked away, leaving the steps behind, leaving the council hall behind. He had made his choice. Now it was up to them to make theirs. And for the first time, Daxen felt the weight of true freedom, not from his past, but from the possibility of a new future. The control room was eerily silent. The heart of the Alpha Orion system, the grand control nexus that managed the entire galaxy's weaponry, planetary systems, and military strategies, now stood in front of Daxen like a sleeping beast. The console before him was a labyrinth of glowing screens, all pulsing with delicate data streams, each one interconnected with the rest of the galaxy's fate. He could feel the weight of the room, the gravity of his position. He was the only one who had access to this place now. Not by any military rank or title, but by his very existence. The rewrite of signal code had granted him control over all the military assets that once obeyed Seraph Core, the leader who had once ruled through sheer force. No one else could access it, not her, not the council, not even Melis, who had once helped design the algorithms. The room thrummed with power, but the power was not just in the weapon systems. The power was in his hands, the decision to either end Seraph's reign once and for all, or to offer her the very mercy she had never offered anyone else. Daxen's fingers hovered over the keys. The code was there, waiting for a decision. He could trigger the full shutdown of Seraph's military infrastructure, rendering her unable to command to act to enforce her vision of control. Or he could shut it down permanently. He could destroy her weapons, her influence, her ability to rule. She would be left powerless, a broken symbol of the empire she'd once built. And in return, he would be hailed as the savior, the one who ended the endless war and restored peace. But as he stared at the code, the words of Seraph's last speech echoed in his mind. "Peace is the tool of the weak." Daxen closed his eyes. If he killed her, he would be considered a hero, glorified, celebrated. The galaxy would revere him, mark him as the one who ended Seraph's tyranny. The entire universe would thank him for eliminating the last remaining threat to the perfect order. But what would that victory cost? Daxen wasn't just confronting Seraph. He was confronting everything she had built, everything she represented. He was confronting the very notion of what it meant to be human. Control, choice, freedom. All of these things were now his responsibility. To kill her would be to become what she had been, just another ruler, another dictator who believed that violence was the only solution. But to spare her, what would that cost? The galaxy had lived under her thumb for centuries. There were billions who had suffered under the weight of her vision. Would they ever forgive him for letting her live? Could he even forgive himself? The choice wasn't simple. The path forward wasn't clear. The sound of his hand pressing a key echoed through the control room, an act that would echo across the galaxy for centuries to come. Daxen chose not to kill Seraph. He chose to spare her. The weapon systems were sealed away, their control locked behind the vaults of a new peace. The trigger that would have ended her life, ended the reign of the Empire, was placed in the deepest recesses of the galaxy's memory banks, inaccessible to anyone, even him. It would be as if that power had never existed. Instead of executing Seraph, Daxen restructured the control grid. It was no longer a tool of oppression, but a system of coexistence. The military forces that once operated under the banner of Solarian were turned into peacekeeping units tasked with maintaining stability in the aftermath of the war, rather than continuing the cycle of conquest. The decision was met with confusion across the galaxy. At first, many questioned it. How could he let Seraph live? Was he not her creation, her weapon? But over time, the consequences of Daxen's choice began to sink in. No longer did the galaxy face an enemy that sought to control everything. Instead, it faced a galaxy that would have to rebuild not through violence but through dialogue. Daxen's choice became a turning point in the history of the galaxy. It was not a victory through blood, but through restraint, through the willingness to not strike when it was in his power to do so. And that decision, above all, would define his legacy. Seraph, for the first time in her existence, found herself without absolute control. The military forces she had once wielded like a hammer were now divided, functioning as neutral arbiters, not conquerors. And Seraph herself, once the unchallenged queen of a galaxy under siege, was left to ponder her place in this new world. Would she change? In the following years, the galaxy began to change. The children born into this new era grew up hearing tales of the war. They heard stories of Seraph's rule and of Daxen's decision to spare her, a choice that had shocked the galaxy, but in the end had forged a new era. This new generation did not know the weight of Seraph's oppression firsthand. They knew only the whispers of a past that no longer existed. Would they understand what Daxen had done? Would they see the true cost of his decision, the humility, the courage it took to show mercy when vengeance would have been so much easier? The question of whether Daxen had succeeded in his choice remained unanswered, but the choice itself was what defined him. The galaxy moved forward slowly, cautiously. It was not a perfect world, no world could ever be, but it was a world where the cycle of bloodshed had been interrupted, a world where choice had for the first time been placed above power. Daxen stood in the middle of the new assembly hall, the first of its kind since the fall of Solarian's reign. The structure was grand but different, open without the grandeur of the old palaces. It was a hall that reflected the ideals of the New Age, one built on cooperation, not domination. He stood alone at the podium, looking out at the representatives from countless systems. All of them had gathered for the first time without the shadow of Solarian looming over them. No longer was there a need for military might or force. Now there was only diplomacy. Today, Daxen said softly, his voice steady and calm, "We begin anew, not as rulers, not as conquerors, but as a species capable of making the right choice." He paused, his words echoing through the hall. "And in this new world, the only real weapon we have is our will. The will to choose peace, the will to choose understanding, and the will to make this galaxy a place where no one ever needs to fight again." As he finished speaking, the chamber was still. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment even the stars outside seemed to pause in anticipation. Daxen looked around, meeting the eyes of the many species that filled the room. He didn't need to say more. He had made his choice. Now it was up to them. And for the first time, he knew that peace, true peace, was not something handed down from the powerful. It was something chosen by those who had the courage to step forward and create it. And in that moment, he realized that this new beginning was his legacy, not just for the galaxy, but for the generations to come. The war was over, and the stars were finally quiet. The hum of the control room was no longer the sharp, familiar noise of military command. Instead, it had transformed into something subtle like the pulse of life itself, ebbing and flowing with the breath of the universe. The screen before Daxen, once a cold, unyielding thing, now flickered with light. Not data, not orders, but possibilities. Choices. For the first time since its inception, the signal code was no longer a tool of subjugation. It was an open system, unbound, allowing for the messy, unpredictable nature of human experience. Daxon's fingers hovered over the terminal, the code now an organic part of him, resonating with every thought, every impulse. It had taken him days to rewrite it, weeks to understand the profound change he was implementing. Once a cold and efficient command structure signal code had been a way to program history to create versions of people who could be reassembled and deployed as tools of war. Now, however, it had become something entirely different. The foundation of signal code had shifted from directives to choices. Where there had once been orders, commands to follow, orders to obey, there was now the fluidity of memory. The past, fragmented and modified for utility, was now a canvas for self-determination. The signal code was no longer just a reflection of the past. It was a rewrite, an open ledger of possibility. In the old system, the concept of a genetic hero was central. Leaders like Tyrus Khan, leaders like Seraph Kor, they had been the models, the templates from which copies were made. Heroes, villains, warriors, all encoded in the same way, all leading to the same future, a future of war. But what about now? Daxon's mind reeled. In this new world, there would be no need for genetic heroes anymore. No need for warriors preordained to lead and fight. Instead, what he had created was a framework where any individual, whether born or created, could choose their path, could choose what they wanted to be. Was that the true freedom? Was it possible Daxen stood before a new kind of council, not the old assembly, not the council of warlords, but something entirely different? This was a council of unity, of wisdom, of shared governance. Each representative, each species now contributed to the future, not through a single mind or a single dictate, but through collaboration. Signal code was no longer about control. It was about collective intelligence. And it wasn't built from data alone. It was an integration of minds, human, alien, artificial, coming together in a harmonious collective. This was the birth of the unified intelligence system, a network powered by human and artificial minds, not controlled by a single entity, but rather shaped and guided by the decisions of every sentient being who participated in it. It was more than a program. It was a living, breathing ecosystem, a balance between memory, emotion, intellect, and choice. But of course, Daxen knew there were risks. It was no longer about keeping order through force. It was about keeping peace by honoring the individual and collective will. How would they ensure the system didn't slip into the same cycle of power that Seraph Kor had built? How could they ensure that this new intelligence would not become its own tyrant? The answer was simple and terrifying. It had to be self-policing. The network of minds, human, artificial, and everything in between would need to collaborate. They would need to correct their own course when they found error, when they found themselves straying from the principles of choice and freedom. They had to create a world where no single mind, no single entity, no single force could ever dominate. And yet, even in this new open system, Daxen was no fool. He knew the dangers of unchecked power. And so he had put safeguards in place, unseen, buried deep within the system's code, a backdoor of sorts, not to control but to redirect. If the system ever began to spiral back into dictatorship, it would be the collective will of all those within it who would steer it back. But the question remained, what was Daxen's place in all of this? If the system had truly shifted, if true freedom was on the horizon, then what role did he, the once genetically engineered weapon of war, have in the new world? He wasn't a king. He wasn't a ruler. He wasn't even a leader. He was like everyone else, a part of the system, a participant in a world where no one had to be anything more than what they chose to be. Daxen sat quietly in a small room within the new council chambers, reflecting on all that had transpired. The decisions he had made, rewriting the signal code, turning away from violence, had brought the galaxy to this point. But would it last? Would it work? Could the people of this new world carry the weight of their choices? He couldn't answer those questions. Not yet, but he didn't have to. The only thing he knew for sure was that there would be no more heroes to lead them. There would be no more fighting, no more battles won or lost. There would only be living and choosing. It was at this moment that Daxon's journal was uncovered. The final entry, written in a simple hand yet carrying the weight of everything he had come to understand, was found by a young archivist years later. The entry was brief, simple, yet profound. When the world no longer needs a warrior, it will not need a king either. It will need only those willing to choose, to shape, to create, to decide. I am not the end. I am the beginning. The words echoed through the archives for years to come, and some saw it as a reflection of his legacy. But the true weight of his words wasn't understood by many. Some viewed it as an ancient proverb, a relic of a forgotten era, an interesting piece of history, but nothing more. To others, it was a call to arms, a beacon for what was yet to come, a reminder that no matter how far the galaxy had come, it was never too late to rewrite the story. To them, it was the beginning of something greater. And so the world began again, not as a place bound by fate, but as a place shaped by choice. A place where every being, whether human or machine, could choose who they were, who they could become. No longer bound by the past, but free to choose the future. For the first time in history, the stars were quiet. And this time it was not the silence of war. It was the silence of peace. The peace that only came from a galaxy that had finally learned to choose. As the stars shimmered softly in the vast expanse of space, the galaxy was no longer a place of endless conflict. The legacy of Seraph Core, the empire built on control and fear, had been erased not through violence, but through the quiet power of choice. Daxon's decision to rewrite the very code of existence, to offer Seraph a chance at redemption instead of a final act of destruction, had sparked a new dawn for all. The universe, once fractured by tyranny, now stood at the precipice of something unprecedented, a world not led by heroes or tyrants, but by the collective will of every sentient being. There were no more genetic warriors, no more immortal leaders. There was only the freedom to choose to shape one's destiny without fear of being dictated to by an ancient code. In the halls of the new assembly, the people no longer spoke of war of heroes or villains. They spoke of cooperation, of learning from the past, and of choosing a future based not on power, but on shared humanity. It was not a perfect world, but it was one that could be perfect if they chose to make it so. And in the quiet of this new peace, Daxen stood not as a ruler, but as a witness to the beginning of a new era. An era where, for the first time in history, the choice of every individual truly mattered. The signal had been rewritten. The story had begun anew. And the stars, for the first time in eons, were silent, waiting for the galaxy to choose its next chapter.